But right now, we're going to speak to Ella Whelan, Spite columnist and author, of course, of What Women Want, because there's an organisation that's come out and said there's not enough diversity amongst the teaching profession, right? And they're suggesting that we need to have more representation of more sorts of different people. Apparently, too many teachers are too white in this country. Let's find out why. Ella, very good morning to you. Welcome.
Morning.
Now, I had a look at this organisation which was supposedly giving out this advice, right? And they've got an interesting name. I think it's some kind of foundation or other. It's a charitable organisation. And every single one of their trustees, of which there are 10, is completely white. Now, I don't care whether they're white or not, but the fact that they're calling for teachers to be less white seems a bit ironic to me.
Well, the funny thing about this story is that there's two parts to it. The first is that the suggestion that schools and pupils need teachers who look like them in order to excel, which I think most people would disagree with. You know, a good teacher is a good teacher.
Yes.
And it's very reductive for, black teachers or teachers who are from ethnic minority backgrounds to suggest that the only kids they can connect with are those from their own communities, and vice versa for white teachers. I think that's a nonsense, and it's a total misunderstanding of what the teaching profession is about. You know, it's a calling in a way, and you have to care about all kids, and teachers do care about all kids, no matter what their background. So I think that's very dodgy.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair enough to ask the question, which the National Foundation for Educational Research has asked, which is, why is there a problem with the fact that they've given the stat that 96% of senior staff in schools are white, not from a kid's perspective, but from the perspective of whether or not there's a block. And I was reminded of the story that came out in March about Robert McCoyer, who is the only black scientist, the only black chemistry professor in the whole of the UK out of 575. And he was telling a story to the BBC about how, in the 15 years of him putting in funding applications and doing all the stuff that professors have to do to try and get research moved forward, he had never been accepted. And I mean, there's very few conclusions can come to other than what he believes, which is that his last name has been a block on him in 15 years never being able to get funding, and he's, by all accounts, a very good chemist, as good as any other.
Yeah.
So I think, it'd be ridiculous to suggest that there are still problems in society. But why we have to tie it up with this idea that I think why we have to we should be careful of fetishizing representation, because I think that's a very reductive way of looking at race relations. But I'm very interested in any question that says, is there a problem? Is there some kind of disparity? Well, let's look into it and let's talk about it.
But the thing that people don't talk about very much about this country is that, yes, there are very many parts of it which have got a very mixed population, but there are also very many parts of it that don't have a very mixed population. In fact, the school that my kids go to is almost completely white, because it's in a part of Britain which is pretty white, and we always are told that, you look at London, it's a very diverse picture. There's 50% of Londoners are probably from an ethnic minority of one kind or another, but most of Britain isn't. So for them to say that, even to make the argument that there should be more diversity in teaching, actually is against their own argument, because if they're saying that, most kids would prefer to see a teacher that looks like them, well, if they're white, then that's probably true.
Yeah, and I think that it does really reveal the ridiculousness of that first point, which is that, diversity, when we talk about diversity, it's often talked about as if it's a good in and of itself, so that it's simply a good thing to have difference in a room, which, I think kind of culturally we might understand. It's more fun. Maybe I'm biased. One of the reasons I love living in London is you can eat from 5 different countries in one day if you want to, and all of that's great and nice, and that's the kind of the benefits of a melting pot society. But to kind of fetishize diversity, to say that if you don't have it, or if you do live in a kind of monocultural space, whether it's my family's from Ireland, so I can tell you there's large sections of Ireland where you won't see many people who are not from that immediate town in Ireland. To say that there's something wrong with that, I think gets you into dodgy territory, because it's a bit like I think what it does is it paints a kind of reductive picture of what role ethnic minorities play, because you end up sounding like you sort of need a token person of colour in every job or every role, simply to kind of make up the diversity statistics. And that's, never mind what that says about race relations. It's incredibly unfair for people who are achieving things off their own back, not based on their identity.
Well, it is. I mean, it is kind of.
I actually think most. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was going to say it's kind of patronising as well, isn't it?
It is, and this happens a lot with women as well, which is, the whole kind of idea of, which has been floated again, for example, in relation to all the sort of slightly seedy scandals that have been coming out the Tory party of late. The 50-50 representation in Parliament thing has raised its head again. And it always, it always kind of sounds like, and in education you hear kind of getting 50-50 women in STEM and all that sort of stuff. And as a woman, it always feels like you're being used as some kind of pawn, some kind of chess piece that needs to be moved into the right place to make the board look okay.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty insulting.
Well, that's it. I mean, we're told an awful lot of primary school teachers tend to be women, and there's always calls for more men to go into primary school teaching, but presumably there's a reason why it might suit some women more than it might suit some men. I don't know what that reason is, and I wouldn't attempt to try and quantify it, but presumably women do the jobs that they want to do, and men do the jobs that they want to do, and not everybody's the same.
The bottom line always has to be, is there discrimination? Is there a fair playing field? Can you get in and get the right interviews regardless of what your last name is and what your identity is? And if so, then, there are other nuances in, like you mentioned, in life, which mean that different people go for different jobs. Whenever the gender pay gap thing comes out, it's a bit of a cheap joke, but it is always the case that you can point to certain areas, construction, bin men. There's a reason why it's called bin men, is that, for large parts of different sections of jobs in society, different genders go for. And, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, as long as it's free choice, as long as it's people being able to make those choices. I think there's a whole lot of micromanaging that goes on at these kind of, perhaps in some of these charities and these policy wonk institutes, that want to kind of, rather than actually asking what people need in terms of resources and, whether or not it's the case that lots of people aren't going into senior staff positions and teaching because it's an incredibly difficult job, and something that you have to give your entire life over to if you want to become a headmistress or headmaster. But instead of doing that, they sort of say, well, how can we deal with this superficial sort of image basis? And
I mean, it really is tinkering around the edges, isn't it? I mean, the National Foundation for Educational Research is the name of this organisation, and I would have thought they'd be better spending their time actually working out why so many of our kids come out of school illiterate and why they're not being taught properly.
Well, I mean, that's another thing. If you want to look at the disparities in education, we know from the experience of the pandemic that the biggest defining factor in relation to who does well at school and who doesn't do so well at school is class. And the fact of a generation of kids being sent home and suddenly schools realising that actually maybe not everybody has 2 laptops at home or a strong broadband connection, or parents with 8 arms who can be doing homework with 5 different children. You then realise that there is, that's what is the dividing line for most kids, white, black, whatever background they're from. And then indeed there are geographical disparities in, the north and the south because of caste distinctions do differently. So if you want to talk about how we, to use that horrendous phrase I'm so sick of hearing, level up when it comes to, education or whatever it is, then start talking about what's really going on, rather than, you have all this kind of stuff like the Channel 4 documentary, The School That Tried to End Racism, and all these sort of very intense identity politics-based views of education. Most kids, that's not their experience. Their experience is they're friends with everyone in their class, but what defines how they're going to get on well in life is if they have a good home background, if they've got good teachers, and if they've got the resources.
Exactly. Ella, thanks very much indeed.